Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. First of all, I'm extremely really very sorry to my subscriber because I have not been creating a content on a regular basis. So I really apologize for it, but I'll try my best to keep post my blogs, videos on a regular basis. Whatever I have learned during that time period, I'll try to share as quickly as. So without wasting any time, let's go and check the agenda we are going to cover in this video. As you see, the agenda of this video is design to development, where we are going to build and integrate a .NET REST API with the React and deploy on Azure using the Docker file. In this video, we are going to cover different topic, and that's the reason instead of creating one long video, I try to create multiple parts. In the first part, we are only going to cover how you can build a REST API using the .NET Core, and also will use Entity Framework as an ORM for database communication. In the second part, we are going to create a Docker file where we are going to document all these steps that is required to build an image of that REST API. In the third part, we are going to cover how you can set up the build and release pipeline in an Azure DevOps and deploy that Docker file image in Azure App Service. In the fourth part, we are going to set up the React app and try to call the REST API that we built in the first part. And once we complete the fourth part, we'll go to the fifth part where we are going to create again a Docker file, which is going to build an image of our React application, and also will follow the same step to build and create a release pipeline to deploy that to an Azure App Service. And the final part is that you guys like these videos and subscribe to my channel, which helped me to continue motivate myself to create these type of series and videos and share whatever I have learned. So without doing any more delays, let's jump into in first part and create the .NET REST API. If you are interested to this topic, please watch all the 5 parts and subscribe to my channel. And if you like this video, please do share. To begin and create the REST API, first I need to open my app, and I'm using Rider instead of Visual Studio for all my application development. Whether any React application or .NET application, I'm using this Rider too. So I'll go ahead and click on New Solution, and the project that I'm using is ASP.NET Core Web API, and I'll give the name AI YouTube demo. Everything is correct. I have the folder location, it's .NET Framework 8. I don't want any authentication at this point. I just want simple plain API. Hit the create button. So I think the default template get created. It has application setting.json. In this, we are going to define the connection string and any kind of application setting that we have. And this app setting.development.json, this is usually used when you are on the development environment. And now we have the program.cs, where it's just a template, a boilerplate API call has been given. So let's build first and run it so that we can see this default application is working or not. So you can see the default REST API is working, and if I hit this endpoint, which is the weather forecast, it gives me some sample data which comes as a default implementation, or you can say like a boilerplate code. So now the next step is we'll go first of all clean this program.cs, because if you see the controller or the method API endpoints are already in the program.cs. We don't want that. We are going to create separate controllers, and we kind of rearrange this so that we can have a proper folder structure. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a folder first and give the name all controllers. So in this folder, all my controller will be live in, and then I'll create another folder called models. So any kind of a model that we are going to create will go under the model folder. This is the endpoint which comes out of box as a boilerplate code when you choose the template web API. So I wanted to move this endpoint into a separate controller, and the controller that I'm going to call as weather forecast controller. So let me go ahead and create a class, and I'll give the name as weather forecast controller. And this controller will be implemented by controller base. Now we have to give, because we need to create an endpoint, and for that we need to give the API route and use this controller as an API controller. So I gave this route attribute and the route you pattern, which is API, and then the controller name, and this is a API controller. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is this. So I'll create a separate model which I can call as weather forecast model. And now I copy this here, and instead of doing this, what should I do is I'll convert them into the properties. Public date is set. Has anybody used the Copilot? I heard that the Copilot will help to write these type of code much faster. So if you have used the Copilot, please comment and tell me how I can configure the Copilot so that I can avoid typing this. Then our weather forecast class is already. Now the next step is to get this endpoint. So before we create the endpoint, let's bring this to weather forecast controller, and instead of this I'll call as private static read only string formatted, and I'll create a constructor which is public weather forecast, and I'll put the logger here. This is just in case if we need to start logging. Now we are going to move this endpoint, weather forecast endpoint, to our controller. So first I'll create the HTTP get, because this is the get controller, and then I'll give the controller. And what is this returning? It's returning this, which is a innumerable type collection, and I'll give the name. Alright. Now let's copy this, move it here. There was one typo here. Instead of I enumerator, I need to use I enumerable. Okay, I think our controller looks good. Now let's go back to program.cs, and let me remove this because it's not going to use anymore. So let me remove this as well. Let me remove this also. So what we have now, I think the reference is missing. Let me get the reference. Okay, now let's see. Okay, this is giving an error. So what I need to do, what is this error is? Cannot resolve. Okay, I know what is the problem. Now here we use date equals to, we copy this. No. This looks correct. Let me build the solution. Build succeeded. Now what we need to do in the program.cs, because we need to map the controllers and we need to map the routing. So what we need to do is, first thing is I just need to add builder.services.add controllers. And the second thing is we need to add app.use routing and app.map controllers. I think our program.cs is ready, and that is start using the controller. So let's go ahead and test. Awesome. Now if I hit this, I can see it. My API endpoint called successfully. I can see the response coming back. If you wanna make sure that it's working, let's hit the debugger. So you can see my application is now running in the debug mode, and if I click on this execute, you can see the debugger get hit, and this debugger is on weather forecast controller, which is we created. Now with this cleanup, we can able to create multiple controllers inside the controller folder instead of writing everything into this program.cs. So let's move to the next topic of this video, is installing the entity framework and able to connect to the SQL database and write a new controller which will get the data, which will leverage the entity framework and get the data from the SQL Server database. And for that, I have already set up my database, which is to do demo app. And then I have a table also, which is like task manager. And I did put some sample data also in here. So I have these two rows created. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a new controller, which is called task manager controller. And then that controller will be responsible to get all the data from this table. And also we can create another method which filter the record based on the ID. So let's move ahead and first of all install the entity framework. To installation of the entity framework, I need to install the NuGet package. We need Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and I'm using the latest version. I did not use like pre-release, so whatever the release latest version, I'm using that. Click install, and the second package that I need to install is Microsoft.entity.sql, because we are going to connect to the SQL Server. So let's check whether these packets are installed or not. Yep, I can see the Microsoft Entity Framework Core and the SQL Server is installed. Now let's go ahead and create our task manager controller and pull the data from this table and use the entity framework to get the data from this table. Before creating the task manager controller, let's first do some configuration changes which is required to connect to the entity framework. So first thing is we need to set up the connection string, and we need to give the connection string name. So here I gave the default connection, and this is the connection string. I use these placeholders because these placeholder value will get replaced by either environment variable or through the build pipeline. So for this demo purpose, I'll use the environment variable to replace these placeholder value. I'll do the same configuration in app setting also. Sometimes formatting is tricky. Now the next step is to create the entity class. So I'll give a folder database.entities. So all my database entity will be inside this folder, and then I'll create a entity class. So to save the time, I have this already created. So I'll copy and paste. Now the next step is to set up the DB context. So for that, I'll create another folder called context, and then inside this I'll create my context class, which is to do. to do app DB context. Okay. Now we just need to set up a public constructor, public to do app context DB context options. Options colon. Okay, I'm sorry, I forget. DB. This class will be get implemented by the DB context. Now we need to define the DB set, and this DB set is nothing but referencing my entity class, and this entity class is a table that we have created here in the database, and all the properties that we see here are the columns belongs to this table. So I think we are good. Now the next thing is we need to set up the dependency that is required to provide the connection string of this to this app DB context. So for that we just need to add one line of code, which is this, and it's to DB context, and this is a SQL Server, so the reference is being missing. And if you see, we are picking up the connection string and giving the name of that connection string, and as I told you that these are the variables placeholders which is going to be replaced, so either by the build pipeline or we can use the environment variable. So now for this demo purpose I'll hard code the values, and that's why I'm keeping it blank, just because of the security purpose, and I'll fill the value later. Now this is the DB username, which is the username of my database. This is going to be the password of my user through which I can connect to the SQL Server, and this is the server name. So I think we are good with the configuration. Now the next step is to create the to-do controller and write some code to fetch the data from this task manager table and return it as a response. To create the task manager controller, I will go to my controller folder and create a new class called task manager controller. Now that we need to copy some code from our weather forecast controller so that we can do this exercise quick. And I'm going to change here. So this HTTP GET returns all the tasks that we have created under the task manager. So this method will return all the data from this table. And more cleaner version would be you can create another model class in which you can have this task manager as well as success or failure messages. So let's do that. So I'll create a response class, task manager response, and I will copy list task manager. So instead of throwing an exception unnecessary, we'll return the proper response status. This is integer. Let's change the return type, and I need to import the reference. No. Can rename this to task list. Now, instead of returning the task manager, we'll return this task response. I'm sorry. All right, I think we are set. I just need to update the value, which I will do it now. So while I'm entering the values, I'll pause and resume so that we can debug together. So let's run the code and debug it. Before running, let me just build once. Build succeeded, and let's run. So you can see I have two controllers. One is the weather forecast and another one is the task manager, which I just created here. And inside the task manager, I have one method which is get task manager. So if I click try out and execute, and I got the error. Error is good. Only we okay. I think not sure why I am getting this error, because every time when I start a new REST API project, I will get this error, and I need to set this to false, and that will resolve the error. So if you guys also getting the same exception, you can just set this value to false, and if you're not getting, comment like what you have done so that you are not getting the exception every time, this same exception every time when you initiate a new project. So comment and tell me. So it's built successful. And this is another thing, like it throws an exception, and if you refresh a couple of times, it runs successful. So comment if you guys are encountering the same issue or not. So here we are. After setting this value to false, our API get executed successfully, and we can see the response here. And what I will do to show you the cleaner response, let me just copy it. And so yeah, if you can see, we have the task list. Under the task list, we have the data that is returning from the entity framework, that is returning from the SQL table via entity framework, and then the status. So we are almost close to the end of this video. Let's go ahead and implement one more method, which I mentioned during the start of this video, which is like filter the task by ID. So let's go ahead and implement that method, and then we can end this first part. So to implement the filter by ID, I need to create another method, which is HTTP get, and then that's also an HTTP get. So I need to make some changes in the route. So for that, I am mentioning that I need an ID, which is an integer type, and then I will give the name. Sorry, name and task by ID. Now I will define a public method, and for that I'll create another class called task by filtered task response. So this is the common properties. So what I will do, I'll create another call called base response and move these two property there, and implement base response and implement base response. So, and here I will say task manager task. So go back to the controller. Should be public, not private. Public filter task response task by ID int ID and filter task response. Filter task response is so defining initializing this class. So we have the skeleton code ready. Now we just add a logic where filtered task is equals to context dot task manager dot first dot default, like this lambda expression. T equals ID. If filter task not equals to null, then you can just add filter task response dot task is filter task and filter task dot state is equals to 200. Right here. And we are all set. Let's build the code. Build successful, run it. So now we have two methods. One is task manager, which gives us all the tasks. And the second one is by ID, and that is accepting ID as a parameter. And here you can see. Awesome. As I mentioned in the start of the video, this is going to be the series which is going to be divided into multiple parts. We ended up with the first part where we have created a REST API using the .NET Core, C# and use entity framework to get the data from the SQL tables and send it as a response. In the next video, we are going to create the Docker file to create an image of our REST API so that we can able to deploy to an Azure app service using Azure DevOps build and release pipeline. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and share this video. If you have any feedback or anything you would like to say, please mention that in the comment. Thank you, and see you in the next video.